In this part 2 of our jQuery discussion in the first week of jQuery, let's cover some of the most useful jQuery selectors. And this is how jQuery can select an element. So I want you to think about CSS and the document object model and everything you know about the web. And think about how jQuery is not only a JavaScript library, but it has a great ability to access the same selectors that CSS can. So here are a few. We can access by attribute, or where attribute equals a value. So let's say we had an href tag, an anchor tag that equals some website, like let's say mine or cnn.com, something like that. So if it said href equals cnn.com, then we could access that actual anchor tag that has that specific attribute. There's also the colon equals, which is EQ for a number. There's even, first child, greater than with a number. Headers, last child, less than with a number. A not selector, so let's say we wanted to select everything but a specific element, we would write not that element, whether something's odd or not, or actual specific text, which we've already covered, the text part. Anyway, you have to really see these in use to understand it, but just know from this slide that jQuery has an incredible power to select anything you need. So here are some examples of using these selectors. Let's say we wanted to select the list item elements that are only the first children of their parent element. We would call li colon and the first child. That would select the first list item. Let's say we only wanted to select the even table row elements of a table. We would do table greater than tr even. That's used for outputting data with background colors on every other row. That's a pretty common thing that we'll be doing. And let's say we wanted to select the third descendant paragraph element of an element. And so we would say, okay, for the ID FAQs, if the paragraph is equal to 2, because the number starts at 0, that would be the third. And let's say we wanted to select all input elements with text as a type attribute. So think of a form with input type equals text. We would do colon text. And here are the summary of the next of the methods that jQuery mostly uses. These are exceptionally useful. We've already seen next. We've seen next with no selector inside it because the next was applied to our next sibling for the form validation example in this week. And previous is similar. So all these methods are concatenated using a point. So getting the attribute of something, that's ATR. Getting attribute by name only, or name and value, would be passed in the arguments of the parentheses. Similar to JavaScript, there's a CSS property method, and add class, remove class, and toggle class are all things that are very similar to JavaScript. Hide and show are some great methods, and with the term method, just think function, block of code that does something. And hide and show both take a duration. We'll be doing a lot of each as well. Each takes a closure, a function inside the element, so that if you loop around, let's say, an array of the DOM, you could apply a closure for each element that you loop around. Again, this can be very confusing if we're looking just at a PowerPoint slide, so we just need to look at examples. So here are some examples of jQuery methods. The first one gets the value of the source attribute of an image. So this might be a pathway to where the image is stored. Similarly, if we want to set the source of an image, we could use a second parameter in the attr arguments. So this attr source tag and applying the image source location would set the new attribute for source tag of an image to that one element. Next, we can set the value of a color property of all H2 elements simply by using the H2 selector, adding .css, and then the first parameter is the property, the second is the value. We can also add a class to the H2 descendants of the FAQ's ID. So just like we had our example in week 9 where we had the plus minus links that repetitively we were showing the last couple of weeks, if we add class minus, it's very similar to JavaScript. And this is an example of, the last example here is an example of running a function for each anchor tag within an image list. So we're saying for each anchor tag inside that ID, let's do something with it. So those are some good examples, but again, you have to see how they work. And a lot of the best documentation comes from docs.jQuery.com. Now these are some useful jQuery event methods. We've already seen the document ready. We've seen the click and even the toggle. But there's unload, which would be the same as body unload. So when a page changes, that event would happen. There's an error. And what handler means is that you can have a variable that comes in that event that we can log and we can see what the values are. So there's toggle, double click, and mouse enter, mouse over, mouse out, and hover. So you can see that there's a lot of JavaScript evident inside these jQuery event methods. And this is an example. Here's a handler for the double click event of all text box that clears the clicked box. So by applying a double click event listener to all elements that have a text attribute and input type, we can say, okay, let's clear out the function. So on double click, we clear out all values of input type fields that have the type text. And the next example is a handler for a hover event for each image element. So we can say, okay, for each one of these guys, hover, for each image inside the image list, let's alert the mouse pointer is moved into an image, and then the hover out would be alert the mouse pointer has moved out of an image element. Now think of what that would be like coding in JavaScript. You would have to have two different functions separated, and we'd have to have on mouse out instead of combining them into one obvious hover. So if you hover over something, you're going to have to hover out of it. Now here are some other event methods that you should be aware of. There's the bind method, where we can bind a click event to a handler. We can unbind that event. Also, there's a one event method, which attaches a single event handler and removes it after it runs one single time. And there's trigger. So far we've seen click events. And you're going to be seeing trigger click, you're going to see bind click, and the examples are very similar when you see them. So we'll have to go into the differences of each. This is an example of storing an event handler inside a variable. So we have a variable that equals some function closer, and inside there, that statement would be the event handler. So it could be click dot something. Now this is an example of the bind method. So binding is post jQuery 1.5, and you can see that we're binding both a click and a quick click event to a hashtag clear. So whatever that ID element is, both those events are bound to that. So think of it as a persistent event listener. And the shortcut method of this bind is click. So we've already done the shortcut method. We can actually attach event handlers to do separate events, like click. The function here is clear click, and we've applied it to two different elements on click and double click. So you can write one function and apply it to anything you need. Now this is how we can remove an event handler from an event. We can unbind that event handler at a given point in our script to remove that event listener. And the second example is that one example, the one event handler that only runs once. So one would automatically remove that event listener. We can also use the trigger method to trigger an event. So here we see the trigger applied with a click, and also the click method with a shortcut. So we're going to be looking at the FAQs example in a separate video. That's where you can see some of these implemented. It's a redo of the JavaScript version of this from the text. And this is how we can use the shortcut method to trigger an event from an event handler. So here we go. When the text is when any element that has an input type of text is double clicked, we can trigger the click for the clear. And that's the ID of whatever's being clicked to trigger out any clear button. Anyway, this assumes a lot, and you need to see it as an example. So This ends part 2, and there will be more to this week, but you need to see the FAQ section code in jQuery.